You're listening to The Wrap,
a Warren Averett podcast for business leaders,
designed to help you access vital business information and trends when you need it,
so you can listen, learn, and then get on with your day.
Now, let's get down to business. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of The Wrap. We are here today for episode 73. We are continuing with our new season called the Business Lifecycle. And today I have a guest host with me, Chris Branch. Welcome, Chris, to hosting the podcast.
Thanks, Kim. I appreciate the opportunity to join and looking forward to the discussion we're going to have today.
Can you take just a minute and introduce yourself to our listeners? Tell them a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. So as Kim mentioned, my name is Chris Branch. I work in our Birmingham office with our tax and advisory group. I've been here 9 years, looking forward to getting to a decade here in the next 365 days. So I primarily work with our construction and real estate clients. That doesn't mean that I don't dabble in a lot of other things as well. But all that being said, been here a long time. Looking forward to talking with Kim and Hanny today.
Well, we're glad to have you, and I look forward to our discussion and to continue our discussion in the business life cycle. Just to recall, we started with startup phase, moved into the growth phase, and then into maturity. And today we're talking about exit transition, which is a really exciting stage of the life cycle. And we have our in-house expert on all things exit, and that is our partner, Hanny Akl. Hanny, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Do you want to reintroduce yourself to the listeners that maybe haven't listened to you on this before?
Sure, absolutely. It's been a little while. So, as Kim said, I lead our transaction advisory practice. I think it's important maybe to step back a little bit and walk through my career for a second. I started here in Birmingham at the Big Four for a few years and then came over to Warren Averett about manager level. At that time, I was still working in audit, but got a lot of experience in all kinds of businesses. So small and large, public and private. All types of businesses, from manufacturing to government contractors to technology businesses, service businesses, and all alike. So really great experience throughout. And then a few years later, I had an opportunity to leave the firm and run a small business here in Birmingham, which I did for a couple of years, positioned it for exit, and then actually did a transaction. At that time, came back to Warren Averett and started what is today the M&A practice. So hopefully we can give some insights since I've been on both sides of the table in this case, and we can give some value to the audience today.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. And so when we think about the exit phase of a business, that could mean a lot of different things. So how would you describe what the exit phase is, and how does it fit into the business life cycle?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think as we walk through exit, it can mean a lot of things, and we'll talk about exit options in a little bit. But I want everyone to understand when I say the word exit, it doesn't just mean an outright sell. It actually, we're talking about several different things, from recaps to small minority sales to an outright sale. So let's just keep that in mind as we're walking through this podcast. But it's interesting to think about, it may not be so much the actual exit as it is the timing of the exit. And I think, one thing that Kim, you and I are always talking about is, helping clients always plan for an exit, even from the start of a business. So if you're starting a business tomorrow, let's say, the key strategic initiative is, well, what does the exit look like at that moment? And that may be 5 years from today, it may be 10, maybe 20. But let's start talking about that from the beginning. And so it's not so much, if you are doing that, it's not so much what the exit is, because you're kind of planning for that regardless. It's really more about the timing of the exit and when.
So, Hanny, that's a great point. You talk about planning for the exit, honestly, from the very beginning, but going a little bit more into the actual exit, what are some triggers that kind of bring upon beginning to really start about that exit and transition into that next phase of the business?
Yeah. So, it's a magic question. Like when do I exit? There is no right or wrong answer, right? And, we may talk about seller and buyer's remorse later, but this is a good moment to remind people that seller's remorse is real and we see it throughout a transaction. And so it's important to just try to keep the emotions out as much as possible. Now, there's natural causes to when you should exit, right? So think about like age is probably the number one thing. And that doesn't mean you're 80 years old and that means you have to exit. We have plenty of business owners that are 80 and 85 years old running their businesses and doing well with that. And they're not thinking exit today. Exit, again, in terms of what we consider exit. And then there's 45 and 50-year-olds that, are at a moment in time where they really need to, or they're thinking about an exit for other reasons. Maybe it's a career shift. That's important to consider. Hey, I've been doing this for a long time. Maybe my family owned this business for a while and I'm third generation. I'm 45 and I think I want to pivot into something else. So we see that. We see grandchildren coming along, children coming along. I hate to go down a negative path, but divorce. And cancer and medical reasons really do force people's hands into an exit. So those are some reasons that start to come along. Sometimes the business outgrows you. And that's okay as well. I mean, running a $5 and $10 million business is one thing. Running a $100 million business is another. And sometimes you just don't have the skill set for that. And that's okay. It's time to bring on a partner at that moment. And last but not least, probably, we're seeing a lot of this these days, but distress. If a business is in distress, that kind of puts you in a situation where you probably need to bring on a partner or do an outright sale. And so, we are seeing a little bit more of that uptick these days. So just something that I was going to throw out, in the last 12 months, we've had several situations where, business owners were looking to sell their businesses or had, unsolicited offers 2-3 years ago in the height of Corona and after. And they didn't take the offers. And then fast forward to today, they're actually being forced to sell for whatever reason. Some of the reasons we just described, some are good, some are bad. And they're just not getting the same offers that they were before. So that's something to think about. I think of 2 specific examples if we want to get into examples here. So 2 specific examples that I can think of. A couple of years ago, we had, a salt of the earth business, small business, but they had an unsolicited offer from a strategic, so basically a business in the same business as theirs, come along and offer $5 million for that business. Business owner wasn't in position to sell at the time, even though, their runway was running out. It was time for them to sell, but they didn't think the offer was quite where they wanted to, and so they didn't take it. Fast forward 2 years, this is, this moment now, they're ready to sell, go back to that same, offer. And those guys, aren't even on the table. Went to a couple of others and they're getting about half the price of what they were before. So between 2 and 3 million. And it's hard to get that number out of your head. We had 5 million before. Why am I not getting that now? The business is still the same, if not better today than it was then. There are some market conditions here and other things that play into that. But unfortunately, they're just not going to get there. And they're going to have to make a decision. Is this enough for them to retire on? They're an older couple, but is this enough for them to retire on? Can they get their head wrapped around, half the valuation at this point? We have another manufacturing business, and there's several businesses that did really well coming out of Corona. Others didn't do well, but there's several that did do really, really well. And these guys got an unsolicited offer. And I mean, this business was doing probably 10 times what they were before Corona. And so, they got an unsolicited offer that was more than this business would have ever been worth. And the business owner thought, you know what, we're riding this wave. I'm going to continue to ride it. I'm going to hold on to this business for a little while. Why would I sell post-tax? Here's what I'm going to get. Why would I sell now? I could make that up in 2 or 3 or 4 years. Well, unfortunately, the foresight wasn't there. Business is starting to dry up and go back to what we would consider normal. And now those offers just aren't anywhere near what they were before. You can kick yourself if on situations like that. There's plenty of positive examples as well. But those are 2 that resonate, that are here and now right in front of us, that, we kind of look back and say, hindsight's 2020, you probably should have taken it then. So the only thing I'll try to tell our audience here is just kind of weigh all the facts and circumstances at the time and just make the best possible decision you can. Try to hire advisors around you, whether it's us or, investment bankers or whatever. Just try to hire folks around you to help you walk you through those questions, help you answer those questions best you can, and then, make the best decision you can at that moment.
So, Hanny, you just outlined, there are a variety of ways that someone can enter the exit phase, and there are a variety of reasons, but there are some overlapping characteristics of this phase and also challenges. So can you share those with us?
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe this is the best moment to talk through the options that are out there. And so let's kind of put those out there real quick. We could have, and we may have, developed a podcast on this a while ago, but we could have a whole podcast on exit options in and of themselves. Now, we do sit down with our clients. I spend a lot of time with our clients that are just saying, hey, I don't know what exit looks like, next year and a few years. We'll sit down for an hour or two, walk through these things, and kind of educate them on what's there so they can go kind of think about this later on. So I'm going to hit the 7 or 8 items real quick, just so we can, make sure the group knows what we're talking about here when we say exit. We do have these in a slide deck, and so we'll have those uploaded to our website if you want to grab those.
We'll link to those in our show notes. So if you're listening to the podcast, just look down in the show notes. We'll put a link there.
All right. In the show notes. All right. So real quick, intergenerational transfer is exactly what you would think about, family transitions, maybe to kids or others. These are low cost, least disruptive type of exit option here, but there are family dynamics, and the sales price is usually a little bit lower than some of the other options. Second, management buyouts. This is where managers, of course, are trying to buy the business off of the business owner. Again, you have continuity of the business, highly motivated buyers, so that's good. But usually the sales price is a little bit lower, but you also have to be careful on this option, simply because sometimes the managers may sandbag the business and or hold you hostage if the deal isn't really going the way they want. They may threaten to leave or whatever, and it doesn't always go well in that case. So be very careful when you're walking down a management buyout path. Partner buyouts, of course, that's a very planned and controlled process. But again, there could be potential discord between the partners. Sales price is usually a little bit lower than some of the other options. An ESOP, so employee stock ownership program. This is where, you may get the highest sales price, but it's very expensive to do this. Also highly complicated, and, it doesn't always fit, it doesn't fit most situations. Sell to a third party, which we're always talking about and everybody knows and loves. This may yield a little bit higher sales price, maybe provide you a way to walk away fairly cleanly over a year or two. But these are very hard and they're very emotional, and most people don't realize that these are very hard to close. And so we'll talk a little bit about those things as we go along. Recapitalization of the business, so dividend recap, minority recap. This is where you're bringing on a partner. Maybe you get a second bite of the apple later on as the business grows. But you also lose control of the business, and the culture shift is a real thing. So you have to worry about that. And then one that most people don't talk about, but it is an option, is liquidation. Shut your doors, sell your assets, and call it a day. So those are the options. So as we kind of think about characteristics, it's really about how much runway as a business do you have? Where are you in the life cycle? But the common denominator of all of these options, especially to yield the highest valuation, the best possible transaction, is a growth story. I think most people kind of skip over that particular point, but I will say that when you have a really good growth story, so the business over the last 2, 3, 4, 5 years has been growing, and again, it's not because of like a Corona pop or anything unnatural. It's more about, the business is just doing well, whether it's through M&A or other organic factors. The growth story is really, really important to getting the best possible transaction you can. So I think that's something to really think about as we work our way through value drivers, or let's just think about like detractors of value. So I'll put it in terms of, what detracts value. You can always flip it to the opposite side and look on the positive side. I'll kind of pepper through a few things that we see more often than not. So concentrations, customer or vendor concentrations, heavy competition, no secret sauce. So it's more of a commodity business. Maybe it's discretionary spending rather than mission critical spending. Lack of recurring revenue or predictable revenues, low margin business potentially, lack of leadership, lack of talent within the business, and, quite frankly, high turnover. Maybe there's a situation where, you have a lot of employees that are, starting to exit from your business. That doesn't always bode well. So those things will detract value from the business.
Want to receive a monthly newsletter with wrap topics?
Then head on over to warrenaverett.com/the wrap and subscribe to our email list to have it delivered right to your inbox.
Now, back to the show.
If we want to think about, after we've put together a transaction, we valued the business, and now we're thinking about what we call deal killers. And so it's a little bit different than what you would consider, value drivers. This is where, these will derail the deal. And so I kind of thought through our last, 10 or so transactions and what were the common themes that we saw, that broke down those transactions. Boiled down to these few issues. Messy books and records. So your financial statements just aren't in good shape. They're hard to explain. They're hard to put together. So that causes all kinds of problems. We talked about flat or declining revenue or profits, so not having the right growth story. The trends are telling a different story than what you're telling folks about where the opportunities are in the business. We have all kinds of problems when it comes to, for instance, sales tax. Like we're in the middle of a deal as we sit. And we had this conversation with the client at Target yesterday, but they weren't filing taxes in a particular state. And it's a technology business. And they didn't realize that they needed to file in this state because that particular state, I think it was Texas, had some special rules around it. And so when we did our calculations and ran through all the numbers, it's a $200,000 impact to the business. Well, or a liability to the transaction. And so as our client's looking at this thing and trying to figure out how to make this work for this particular business owner, it's a distressed deal. He was already going to walk away with very little cash. And in this case, when you factor that in, he's actually going to come out of pocket to have to do this deal. And that's a problem. Now, our client is trying to figure out an earn-out scenario where he can put money in his pocket later on. But this is one of those things where that falls on the seller. These issues obviously are the seller's problem, and those get pushed to his side of the balance sheet and his side of the transaction document, and they have to figure out how to shore this up. So I don't have an answer on where we're going to go with that one, but it is a real problem. Structure of the deal is important, stock versus asset deals and everything that goes with that. Legal issues was another thing we're coming across a lot. Undocumented arrangements, undocumented contracts, lawsuits. Those are a big deal. There's exposure there. Unreasonable expectations from the business owner. That also seems to come up a lot and is causing the deals to fall apart. So maybe the transition period isn't quite right. Cash at close isn't quite where they want it. The valuation, of course, is always a big deal, and there's some disparity there. And then there's, a bunch of personal and unusual expenses that work their way through the business. You got to be real careful with those. The most notable example I have, and I'm smiling because, this is one of those situations you would have never expected, but we were diligencing a CPA firm, and this business did about $5 million in EBITDA, so a good sized business. More than half of that EBITDA was personal expenses. And as we're working through this thing and we're, peeling back the onion and we're finding, hey, he's got his neighbor on payroll and he's got his neighbor's mortgage on, this thing. And we've got, extravagant travel. And we've got every child, on payroll, which we see, we see pretty often. And just all kinds of things. You can't even imagine the things that we were seeing in this thing. But as we were thinking about it, we're looking at it and we're saying, man, this guy's throwing in like $3 million worth of ad backs that are all personal, and he's a CPA, and y'all know this well, Kim and Chris. We are under a code of ethics,
right?
And so as we started talking to our client about, hey, this is problematic, not because these things are unusual. We get it. You run personal expenses through, but this guy's a CPA, and he's running a firm, and you're going to need this person to run the firm going forward. He has to sign off on these audits, tax returns, you name it. What if he's pushing these things through for his own clients? That puts you at some extreme risk. Going back to the legal risk here. Kind of an
integrity issue there.
Oh my gosh, it was ridiculous. So our client took our advice, kind of walked back through that, thought through all the other things that they were noticing, and they walked away from the deal. And, we were towards the end of this thing because it took that long to uncover all of these things, but we were towards the end and they walked away. And so, these deal killers, as I'm calling them, they are real. And I don't want the audience to think we don't get deals done, right? So we do deals, we do get to close, but that's our job. And so, there's plenty of positive and negative stories that we have to go through that kind of will frame out kind of where transactions are. And Chris, you said this earlier. Every deal is different. And so it's really hard to frame out a generic answer to the question you asked, but hopefully this gives the audience at least a few things to think about.
So, Han, we've talked a lot about the seller side today. Talk a little bit about evaluating your buyer, because I know a lot of sellers are thinking a lot about the dollar figures that they're going to get walking away from the deal, but I'm sure a lot of people want to make sure that the buyer is going to be able to fulfill that, as well as that the buyer is going to come in and treat their business the same way that they treated it.
Yeah, that's a great question. And so most sellers don't believe they can ask questions and do what we would consider reverse diligence. And so in this case, I mean, we would absolutely advise before you share anything, don't even bother, answering any of their questions. Instantly flip to, why did you come to me? And so there's a few questions that I think that you can ask these folks. And so I'll pepper through those real quick, and then we'll kind of back up and frame this out a little more generally. But how did you find us? Why are you interested in our business? What experience do you have, in businesses like ours? What are your plans for us if we move forward? What deal do you have in mind? So let's start talking about just loosely structure of the deal. How are you going to finance this arrangement? Well, I'm going to touch on that in a little bit. But what other deals have you done? Let's talk through, what experience you have in this particular space. And so asking these questions, not sharing any information, but just walking through these, asking them to come down and visit with you. That's always a telling moment. Are you willing to fly to me wherever you happen to be? And let's just sit down and talk through this. I think is a good way to start. I will say, and you would expect me to say this, hiring an advisor at this moment is good. So if you are entertaining the idea of a transaction and, you get some answers to these questions and you feel like it's moving in the right direction, definitely hiring an advisor, whether it's an attorney, accountant, or investment bankers, where we would lean. I think that's really, really important. Now, I think this is as good a moment as any to throw out, the market today. Corona lended itself to a lot of folks choosing to want to own their own business and get out and try to find a business to purchase instead of starting from scratch. Excuse me. And so there are, and I don't want to make this sound bad, but there are a lot of posers, kind of air quote the posers out there. We do, work with a lot of great groups, and there are single shingle folks out there that are fantastic, that are looking for the right type of business for themselves. There are larger groups, of course, that you would consider private equity or family offices or even independent sponsors that, are good groups. So don't get me wrong on, there's plenty of folks out there that can do a transaction and should do a transaction. You should do a transaction with. However, there are a lot of folks that came out of Corona that are looking for businesses that don't have the wherewithal to do the transaction. And so you have to be, very careful. They don't have the experience, or they don't have, the knowledge of that particular industry. They don't have the financing to get it done. And so it is important to ask these questions and then ask for proof. So, just kind of work your way through those questions and make sure you do some reverse diligence. The only other thing I'll mention is, every transaction is not always about price. And so don't focus so much on what is the overall purchase price as it is what is the overall structure of the transaction.
So a lot of times, especially the businesses that we work with are closely held family businesses. And with that comes some dynamics of emotions and challenges of working with your family and one wanting to exit and the other not. So how do you work through that, and how would you advise business owners if they are in that type of business setting, to navigate this process while knowing that they're dealing with all of these other challenges?
Oh yeah. And if any of us, and we talked about remorse, excuse me, we talked about remorse earlier, but I mean, if you've ever sold a car or a family house that you grew up in, you feel it. So imagine selling a business, especially one that you've been in for a long time, or let's just take it one step further. Let's just say it's a third generation business. I mean, the emotions that come with that are insane. What's grandfather, grandmother going to think, our late grandmother, grandfather going to think if I sell this? But you have to take the emotion out. And I know it's easier said than done, but you have to try to take that emotion out and focus on the facts and circumstances in front of you. And I will say, and I've said this a couple of times already, but hiring an advisor at this moment is your best bet, because they will help you take the emotions out, focus on what's important, and then work through those things. There is no script to a transaction as much as it feels like there is one. There isn't. And so working through, the steps and all of the things that are happening are important. And I don't think, you or I are in a position to do that as a business owner. You're not in a position to do that. And so somebody objectively coming in is going to be your best bet.
So, Hanny, you talk a lot about the dynamics of a family business and stripping the emotion out. Are there things that you've seen in transactions to help create a longer lasting legacy within that business, even if the family is coming out?
Yeah, I think, advice I got a long time ago, and it resonates here and in a transition too, is working yourself out of a job. And so I think business owners, and it's interesting, we get into these conversations all the time, but business owners believe that they're adding value by doing more within the business. And unfortunately, it's actually a detractor of value. So if we walk into a transaction and we find the business owner has their hand in every pot, and their relationships and employees are loyal to them, and everything flows through their office, that's a problem. And that can be considered a detractor of value, going back to what we talked about before, and it can be considered a deal killer. Kind of falls into both buckets, if you will. And so you got to be careful. But as it relates to like your legacy and all of those things, I mean, that's how you create the legacy is, creating processes, procedures, hiring the right people for the right seats, delegating all of your responsibilities. And, by the time you get to a transaction, I don't want to say the business owner is irrelevant, but they are at a moment where, the business will carry on with or without them. And take that one step further, you can exit on your own terms at that point because, you're not in the business where some of the natural things that we talked about, whether it's age or bucket list or whatever it happens to be, you're able to do those things even while owning this business. And so now you're exiting on your own terms.
Hanny, this has been really good discussion, and we could probably continue this on for another hour, but we always try to wrap this thing up in 60 seconds or less. So what is your ultimate piece of advice for entrepreneurs when they are thinking about the exit stage?
Yeah, it's hard to wrap up something like this, like you said, in just a minute. But I will say picking the right partner is probably one of the best things you could do. So, I don't want people to lose sight of there are good groups out there. And I think as you are entering the transition or exit phase, if you will, finding the right group to come in, and take over the business is probably the number one thing. Don't be afraid of an exit. Don't wait too long for an exit. Always be talking about an exit. So let's round out what we started the conversation with. You should be always thinking about it. It's healthy to do that. Surround yourself with advisors as well throughout the process, not just in the transaction, but before, whether it's a year, 2 or 5 or 10 years before, surround yourself with folks that have their eye on the market. So folks like ourselves, legal, investment bankers, we know where the market's headed. And so just keeping your eye on those things as you kind of progress through the business and then get into an exit phase is really, really important.
Well, this has been great, Hanny. Thanks for joining us again. And Chris, thanks for joining us as the co-host.
Yeah, thanks, Kim. Appreciate it. Hopefully I've done well enough that you'll bring me along next time as well.
Done a great job. Thanks, everyone. And that's a wrap. If you're enjoying the podcast, please leave a review on your streaming platform.
To check out more episodes, subscribe to the podcast series, or make a suggestion of other topics you want to hear.
Visit us at warrenaverett.com/the wrap.